All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're embarking on a bit of a quest for extreme specificity. You see, the most common trap that founders and product builders fall into is super alluring, yet it's fundamentally flawed. They end up building products for themselves, or maybe for some theoretical idea, instead of an actual, real-world customer. And honestly, it's a fatal error. It drains your resources and leads to products that absolutely nobody wants to buy. So how do we avoid this trap? Well, by getting wildly, almost uncomfortably specific about who exactly is going to use our product.
Okay, let's look at our roadmap for this explainer. First up, we're building the end user profile. Second, finding your North Star. Third, understanding the jobs to be done. And finally, putting it all together by mapping the full life cycle.
Part 1. Building the end user profile and moving beyond abstract data.
If you really want to build a sustainable business, it all starts with deeply understanding a very narrow subset of users. But to do that, we have to contrast theory with reality. Look at standard demographics for a second. Age, gender, income. Knowing your target market is, say, women in their 20s with a middle-class income is practically useless on its own. Why? Because it doesn't tell you a thing about why they actually make decisions. That is where psychographics come in. This dives into their fears, their heroes, their aspirations, and their daily habits. People don't just buy products because of their age. They buy them to achieve a specific goal or to alleviate a very real fear. To truly map this out, we look at 6 crucial elements. We start with those demographics and psychographics. Next, we look at proxy products, meaning if they buy a Toyota Prius, they likely care about the environment and, might actually want your solar panels. Then where are their watering holes? Like, where do they actually hang out, either digitally or physically? We map out a day in the life to understand their routine. And finally, we pinpoint their biggest fears and motivators. By rigorously defining these 6 elements, you aren't just figuring out who your customer is, you are actively filtering out who they are not.
Now, here's a really important distinction. At this stage, the end user profile you've just created is a composite. It is basically a mosaic made up of all the different people you've interacted with during your primary market research. It's a fantastic starting point, but let's be honest, it's still a little bit abstract. We need to take this a whole step further. Which brings us to part 2, finding your North Star, the persona.
So as we zoom in from that broad group, we finally arrive at the persona. And unlike that end-user profile, the persona is absolutely not a composite. It cannot be some fictional marketing creation that you just made up, like Mary Marketing or Ollie Owner. No way. The persona must be one actual, real human being. You are taking all of that abstract data and anchoring it to a living, breathing person.
1. That is literally the magic number. Have you ever been stuck in a boardroom, just endlessly arguing over whether some theoretical customer might want a specific feature? It's exhausting. Focusing on exactly one real person eliminates that squabbling entirely. You just stop and ask, wait, would this specific person actually want it? It incredibly accelerates your decision-making and acts as the absolute North Star for your entire company. Let's actually bring this concept to life. Meet Ed Champ. He was the real-life persona for a company called Sensible. Ed was 40, he managed toy designers at Hasbro, and he loved hanging out with art school graduates. He listened to technopop artists like Thomas Dolby, and his biggest fear in the whole world was having his beautiful design intent totally ruined by engineers. By understanding these highly specific, kind of quirky details, the Sensible team made their abstract framework incredibly sticky. Ed wasn't just a demographic on a spreadsheet. He was a real guy the team could literally call on the phone when they were stuck on a product decision.
Let's look at another persona, Chuck Carl, a facilities manager for data centers. Now, what's really interesting here is how capturing a customer's biggest fear directly dictates their purchasing criteria. A water filtration startup initially thought Chuck would care all about buying a green product, but actual research revealed Chuck didn't prioritize being green at all. His biggest fear? Downtime. If the system went down, his pager went off and he had an irate CEO yelling at him. Therefore, his #1 purchasing criterion was absolute, unwavering reliability. Just look at Chuck's real-life traits to see why he operates this way. He drives an F-150, he's a volunteer firefighter, and he wears an always-on pager. He is a guy who makes level-headed decisions in a crisis to put out fires, both literally, as a volunteer, and figuratively at his data center. These character-driven details prove that you aren't just relying on lazy stereotypes. You are building on a psychographic reality. If you build a product for Chuck, it better not just be green, it better be completely bulletproof. Part 3, jobs to be done and understanding the true objective. Now that we have our singular hero deeply, vividly defined, we need to shift our focus to how they actually interact with problems. This brings us to a brilliantly simple mental model called jobs to be done, popularized by Clayton Christensen. The core idea here is that customers don't merely buy products, they essentially hire them to do a job. You should never, ever ask a customer what product they want you to design. Instead, you have to continually ask why to uncover the actual underlying problem they are desperately trying to solve. And this brilliantly illustrates the concept. People do not want to buy a drill. They want a hole in the wall. If you think your job is just making better drills, you are severely limiting yourself. But if you realize your actual job is helping the customer create a hole, well, that frees you up to innovate entirely new ways to solve the problem, ways that might not even involve a drill at all. Finally, part 4, the full life cycle and mapping the journey. All right, so we have our hero, and we know the exact job they need done. Now we have to map their workflow from the very moment they discover a problem all the way to becoming a loyal advocate. This is the full life cycle use case. First, how do they identify they even have a need? How do they find out about your product? Then, how do they acquire and install it? How do they use it to actually gain real value? How do they pay for it and get support? And finally, how do they spread awareness? Remember, we are mapping this strictly from the customer's perspective. We are actively looking for barriers to adoption before we even start building the product. A really great example of this in action is a startup called Philby. They mapped out the entire furniture buying process for their persona, Amanda Phillips. By mapping her current workflow, which they hilariously dubbed the Nightmare on Decor Street, they identified her absolute biggest pain point: the massive hassle of returning furniture that looked great in the showroom but didn't actually fit in her apartment. By mapping this out in advance, Philby proved that inserting a 3D planning step into her workflow wouldn't be some annoying extra hurdle. It would be a massive relief. They found the exact bottleneck before a single piece of code was ever written. So the crucial point here is you need to integrate, not overhaul. Customers generally really like their current habits. They rarely want to radically overhaul their entire workflow, even if your product is technically way better. By mapping the full lifecycle from their perspective, you learn how to seamlessly slip your solution right into their existing routine, making adoption as frictionless as dropping in a missing puzzle piece. Think about the journey we've just taken. We've gone from broad, abstract demographics to the deep, quirky psychology of a single persona. We've understood the real job they're trying to get done, and we've mapped exactly how a product fits into their actual daily life. The era of building for vague, abstract markets? It's completely over. If you want to build something that truly matters, you have to know exactly who you are serving. So look at your own projects today and ask yourself, who is the one real person you are building your product for? Find your North Star. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep building for the customer.